Hello and welcome to Levant TV's press review for Tuesday, November the 12th. Let's start with papers from the UK. The Guardian leads its front page with a picture of victims of the Typhoon Haiyan with the headline Death, Feet and Humanity at Typhoon's Ground Zero. It also reports on nursing cuts putting NHS patients at risk as hospitals are functioning with 20,000 fewer nurses than they need, and a report on the chairman of the Royal Bank of Scotland, Sir Philip Hampton, saying the power of bonuses on bankers was overrated. The Independent lead their front page with a picture of an Egyptian woman with the headline Cry Freedom, an exclusive report on women's rights in Egypt. It also takes a look at critics of the government's Help to Buy scheme, warning that it could fail to make housing more affordable amid fresh signs that the market is overheating. The Telegraph also features a picture of the aftermath from Typhoon Haiyan, headline Destroyed by Typhoon Haiyan, the city where 10,000 died. It also features a story on 4 million more households facing spiralling energy bills. And the Times front page headlines with Cash for Kidneys offers lure Britons, as it reports on British transplant patients being offered illegally trafficked kidneys. It also reports on one of England's chief constables saying police and public should be more tolerant for antisocial behaviour because much of it amounts to boisterous growing up, and finally features a picture of actress Jennifer Lawrence at the London premiere of her new film The Hunger Games: Catching Fire. Now let's take a look at the top stories in the Middle East. As the Syria crisis continues and the SNC lays preconditions for Geneva talks, let's take a look at what analysts are saying. Germany's Deutsche Welle takes a look at the Geneva talks with the headline Syria's opposition sends mixed messages. It says although the Syrian National Coalition has said it is prepared to attend the peace conference in Geneva, the alliance has made such far-reaching demands that some observers doubt their willingness to negotiate. It notes that in the past weeks, individual representatives of the alliance had placed very strict conditions on negotiations with the Syrian government under President Bashar al-Assad, but their change of position in itself does not clear the path for the conference, known as Geneva II, and analysts doubt whether the SNC is really serious. In reference to the preconditions laid out by the SNC, Deutsche Welle says these hurdles are still too high for a potential conference in December. In reference to an interview with Benti Scheller, director of the Middle East Department at Germany's Heinrich Boll Foundation in Beirut, who says she does not see any significant changes in the SNC's position, they're trying to find reasons to be able to go, but at the same time she said the organization did not want to create the impression that it was against the talks. At the end of the day, she said the demands are impossible to fulfill. It adds that Michael Stevens of UK think tank Royal United Services Institute thinks the SNC's strategy is being guided by foreign pressure. Stevens says, I'm not convinced that the opposition's agreement to the talks is honest. I think it's a political tactic aimed at not losing the West's goodwill and the financial support of the Gulf. It says that the fractured opposition is not only weakened by infighting over the fate of Assad, but the lack of a power base in Syria is making it more and more unlikely that the SNC will be able to negotiate with the necessary authority over the future of Syria. And it adds that Scheller notes the problem is that it already has very little legitimacy because of the coalition has never managed to do anything major inside the country, adding that a number of opposition groups do not even belong to the SNC. It concludes that Stevens also believes President Assad has little reason to give in, saying, I don't see many reasons for him to negotiate. Amidst the ongoing Syrian crisis, Al-Monitor takes a very interesting look at how fighters in Syria are profiting from looting cities. Writer Edward Dark, who headlines his article Islamic Militia Expels Criminal Gangs from Aleppo, reports on Khalid Sarraj, better known as Khalid Hayani, a notorious rebel warlord operating in and around Aleppo. Dark says Hayani was largely unknown from his impoverished background right up until the armed conflict erupted in the province of Aleppo. Soon after, he formed his own militia, the Martyrs of Badr, and through various unsavory activities quickly amassed a small fortune, all in the name of the revolution and fighting against the Syrian regime. Dark describes that Hayani's infamy stems from his well-documented escapades including organized looting, kidnapping, extortion, highway robbery and indiscriminate shelling of civilians adjacent to areas his faction controls with its impoverished and lethal Jahannam or Hell Cannon. Dark adds that along with several other warlords now infamous throughout Aleppo for their reign of crime and terror, he stands out as particularly noxious for his undisguised contempt for the city of Aleppo and its residents. Referring to Hayani's crimes, Dark says his most notorious is the storming and subsequent mass looting of the Sheikh Maqsood neighborhood. Residents there reported that straight after his men took the area one morning around dawn, dozens of car thieves arrived in pickup trucks and proceeded to calmly break into and drive off with all the parked cars, none of which were left by that afternoon. Dark also notes that the unwillingness or perhaps the inability of other good rebel factions to do anything about his crimes has done much to damage and discredit the rebel fighters as a whole in Aleppo. Because of this, Dark believes that it should come as no surprise then that the people of Aleppo are more than happy to see him go, even if it's at the hands of the Al-Qaeda-affiliated Islamic State of Iraq and Al-Shams. However, Dark points out that the ISIS, for its part, has been playing a clever and slick media campaign claiming that it is purging the rebel fighters of traitors, collaborators and criminals. And Dark concludes that needless to say, as hated as the extremist ISIS may be, many people were overjoyed as this little bit of ironically good news in a war that seems to offer very little in the way of positives. In a country gripped with such a messy and bloody war, it seems there are no good sides fighting, only shades of bad to worse. Leading on from the ISIS, America's commentary takes a different look at Al-Qaeda's presence in Syria. Writer Michael Rubin asks, is Turkey supported Al-Qaeda in Syria? Rubin says perhaps the most dangerous group in Syria is Jabhat al-Nusra, the Nusra Front. The group does not hide its sympathy for Al-Qaeda and targets more moderate Syrian opposition groups alongside the Syrian regime. Rubin states that Nusra Front counts Libyans, Saudis, Mauritanians, Chechens, Germans and Turks amongst its fighters. Around Syria, it is an open secret that Turkey supports or at least has supported the Nusra Front. Rubin adds that not only has Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan denied the Nusra Front are terrorists, but Turkish forces have also apparently used al-Nusra as a proxy against the Democratic Union Party, a Kurdish party linked to Turkey's own Kurdistan Workers' Party. Rubin believes that if it comes to a choice between Al-Qaeda affiliate and a secular Kurdish party controlling territory, Erdogan signs with Al-Qaeda. Rubin says that the previously asked Iraqi counter-terrorism officials who monitored the transit of Al-Qaeda about the Turkish relationship with the Nusra Front, they were careful. One official said, "Let's just say that whenever the Nusra Front wants to have a meeting, they know they can do so inside Turkey and won't be bothered." The writer points out at a very crucial point regarding the Turkish Prime Minister saying Erdogan himself, however, has bristled as any suggestion Turkey provides safe haven or even free passage to the Nusra Front. Now, however, there is video evidence. CNN International now has reports on the transit of jihadis through the Hatay airport in Turkey and into Syria. Finally, Rubin concludes perhaps it is time for officials to question the judgment of President Obama for his friendship and personal endorsement of Erdogan, who appears not only to sympathize with the most radical elements in Syria's civil war, but also to be a liar. According to a recent survey by Reuters, Egypt is the worst country in the Arab world to be a woman in. High rates of female genital mutilation, increase in violence, sexual harassment, and the rise in Islamist groups cause women to become the biggest losers rather than prime beneficiaries of the Arab Spring. Thomson Reuters Foundation poll on 22 Arab states showed 3 out of 5 Arab Spring countries in the bottom 5 states for women's rights. We take a look at what some analysts have said about this. Reporting for The Independent, Emily Dugan writes an article headlined "Revealed Egypt is the worst Arab country for women," in which she analyzes the reasons behind these results. Dugan says the fallout from the political upheaval in Egypt has made it the worst country in the Arab world to be a woman in, according to research published exclusively today in The Independent. Dugan explains that increasingly commonplace sexual violence has combined with plummeting female representation in parliament and the growth in more extreme Islamic views to push the country to the bottom of the region for women's rights. Egypt was ranked 22nd below Iraq and Saudi Arabia in polling on 22 Arab states' treatment of women by the Thomson Reuters Foundation. The writer points out that in politics, Egypt's uprising have brought disappointment for women, with female representation in parliament falling from 12% to just 2% following the abolition of quotas. It was hoped that the Arab Spring would present fresh opportunities for women, but instead the situation has got worse for many, as revolts have brought conflict and instability. Dugan refers to the Egyptian colonist and feminist Muna al-Tahawi, who believes the legacy of Hosni Mubarak is living on in the country's abysmal record on women. Al-Tahawi says, "We removed the Mubarak from our presidential palace, but we still have to remove the Mubarak who lives in our minds and in our bedrooms." Dugan claims that cases of sexual assault and harassment are becoming more common in Egypt, though there are scant statistics from previous decades to use as a comparison. More than 99% of women and girls have experienced some sort of sexual harassment, according to United Nations research published earlier this year. According to Dugan, the country's Center for Women's Rights has called the soaring number of rape and harassment cases a social cancer. The writer quotes Jane Kinninman, senior researcher fellow at the Middle East and North Africa at Chatham House, saying that Saudi Arabia probably has the most discriminatory laws for women, but one thing that has become worse in Egypt than Saudi is the number of women in parliament. Under the Mubarak regime, there used to be a quota for women, but they got rid of it when they had elections. Thanks to a top-down decision from the king, Saudi is doing much better with about 20% of seats represented by women. To conclude, Dugan believes that Egypt's ranking will be a further blow for the country's international reputation ahead of its appearance on Thursday before a UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in Geneva. It will be the first time Egypt has appeared before a UN human rights body since the revolution in 2011. Amongst the issues the country's representatives will be questioned on is how the revolution has failed to improve lives for women and how in many cases it has made it worse. In an article headlined "Egyptian Woman Losing Rights at a Fast Pace," Reuters Foundation CEO Tony Gabriel interviews Monique Villa, the CEO of Thomson Reuters Foundation, who gives an in-depth explanation as to why Egypt came last in a recent poll on women's rights in Arab world. Tony Gabriel claims women's rights are generally perceived to be much worse in other Arab countries such as Saudi Arabia, Yemen or Somalia. But according to Monique Villa, it's important to bear in mind this is a perception poll, meaning it is based on gender experts' perception of women's rights across the Arab League countries. Villa adds Egypt soared badly in every category from violence against women to reproductive rights to the treatment of women in the family and their inclusion in politics and the economy. Villa points out that these experts told us that traditional patriarchal norms have been reinforced. In addition to that, the increase in violence, instability, corruption, and in the number of bribes, combined with a vacuum of security and total impunity for the perpetrators of violence, has led to the situation that is clearly reflected in the poll. Villa also refers to the recent steep rise in the number of abductions of young women, especially in the Sinai Peninsula where security is weak. Villa explains that in Saudi Arabia, women cannot drive or do gymnastics. In fact, they cannot do anything without a male guardian. However, they have access to healthcare, education, finance, and contraception. And when asked whether there are any positive achievements that can be noted in terms of women's rights in Egypt in recent years, Villa states the situation is very grim. However, some activists still find reasons for optimism. They point out how the revolt has made women at the margins of society more aware of their rights. Villa, however, indicates that the rise of political Islam in Egypt has had a real impact on secularism. Most political gains for women have been lost. Women are struggling to preserve their dignity, and far from progressing, they are now fighting to preserve some of the rights they had before the Arab Spring. And to conclude, Villa says those very same women who fought shoulder to shoulder with men demanding social change in Tahrir Square and on the streets across the Middle East were expected to return to their traditional roles of mothers and wives once the crowd has dispersed. Women are still longing for spring. And reporting from Cairo, Reuters' Yara Bayoumi also analyzes the reasons behind the bad results for Egypt in an article headlined, "Analysis, Arab Spring Nations Backtrack on Women's Rights," Paul says. Bayoumi sees that while the situation is dire, some activists saw reasons for optimism. For one thing, the revolt led more poor women and those on the margins to be aware of their rights. Here, Bayoumi quotes Nihad Abu Qumsan, head of the Egyptian Center for Women's Rights, saying women's rights have traditionally been a concern of the intellectual elite in Egypt, where many are illiterate and live below the poverty line. Abu Qumsan adds that Egyptians used to suffer from the fact that talk of women's rights came across as talks limited to the crème de la crème ladies of society, but the big challenge women faced led to women's issues being discussed on the street by ordinary women and illiterate women. Bayoumi states that while there is a slight improvement in political participation for women under the army-backed interim government, there is still a long way to go, some analysts said. Bayoumi refers to the head of Ombudsman Office for Gender Equality in Egypt, Fatma Kafaji, who says the whole image of women during Morsi's rule was that of a woman is a mother who should be bearing children, and that is the most important thing. The writer points out that the momentum continued to build for improvements, claiming that advocacy for women's rights is much more active than before. Bayoumi cites Amal Abdelhadi, head of the Board of Trustees of the New Woman Foundation in Egypt, who says it is important not to feel defeated. Abdelhadi claims these days it's very depressing, so if you don't push yourself to see positive aspects that we are working for in the long term, you die. And to conclude, Abdelhadi adds the revolution have not failed women because they gave women the chance to be there and to see that if they don't force themselves into the space, they won't achieve. We have to force it. Now let's take a look at the top headlines from international papers. Russia's Moscow Times lead their front page with the headline, "Russia and the US vie for Asia influence," as President Putin gets ready to visit Vietnam and South Korea. The International New York Times leads its front page with the headline, "Typhoon's Devastating Trial," with a picture of the aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan. And from the UAE, the Gulf Times leads with the headline, "US reassures allies over Iran deal," as US Secretary of State John Kerry says America is not in a race to reach an agreement. And finally, Iran Daily leads its front page with the headlines, "Iran and IAEA agree on nuclear cooperation roadmap," as it reports on Iran and the International Atomic Energy Agency's bilateral cooperation on outstanding issues. That's all for today. I'll be back tomorrow for another press review.